This is Western European politics and transatlantic relations. And this is lecture 6, and today we're going to be talking about Detente in Europe with particular reference to West German Ostpolitik. So we're really talking about the period mid to late 1960s through to the mid 1970s. Now, by way of introduction, I want to think about the shape of post-war Europe, or as Timothy Garton Ash has described it in one of the books on the reading list, In Europe's Name. He describes it as Yalta Europe, by which he basically means that Europe is divided into two rival empires. You have a communist empire in Eastern Europe and, if you like, an American-led empire in Western Europe. Now, as the slide makes clear, my argument is that the origins of the Cold War basically lie in Europe. It lies in Europe in the sense that the dispute between East and West arises over the Stalinization of Eastern Europe, disputes over things like the future of Poland. So as I say, the roots of the Cold War very much European in that sense. What basically happens after 1950, though, is that the East-West confrontation becomes increasingly globalized. I would say 1950 because it's in 1950, obviously, that you have the outbreak of the Korean War. So whereas in some parts of the world, the Cold War brings instability, particularly in the developing world, particularly in Asia, I would also argue that in the 50s, 60s, 70s, really right the way through until 1989, Cold War Europe itself is remarkably stable, at least after 1953. Again, why 1953? Because 1953 obviously sees Stalin's death. And yeah, the third point or fourth point on the PowerPoint here is essentially Europe is subsumed into these two rival empires, which essentially enforce a degree of stability. That's not to say that there isn't at periodic intervals disorder, particularly within the Eastern Bloc. 1953 obviously witnesses an uprising in East Germany. A few years later, 1956, you see something very similar happening in Hungary, which is put down extremely brutally by Soviet tanks. And a similar situation again in Czechoslovakia in 1968. But the fact is, these internal problems within the Soviet Empire don't spill over into a wider into a wider confrontation between East and West. Probably the only exception in this period in terms of the overall stability of Cold War Europe is Berlin. This is in Berlin that East and West essentially meet. Berlin finds itself in a particularly odd situation in the post-war period. In many ways, late 40s, 50s is a sort of microcosm of Germany as a whole, in that it is divided into four separate zones. You have the three Western zones, each zone controlled by one of the three Western occupied powers, the United States, Britain, and France, and the fourth Eastern zone in control of the Soviet Union. And this situation was, in theory, supposed to be a temporary affair. This was how Berlin was supposed to be administered in the immediate years after the Second World War with the Allied occupation. But what starts as a temporary affair soon becomes permanent. And for obvious reasons, the Soviets and then, after 1955, the East German authorities were particularly unhappy with the situation because essentially West Berlin, that is the three zones occupied by the Western powers, effectively become a small Western island in a communist sea. West Berlin basically right in the middle of East Germany, which obviously is part of Eastern Europe, the communist Eastern Europe. So there is a Western presence right, as I say, a small island right in the middle of this communist sea. And it becomes increasingly clear that Soviet leaders want this little Western island to disappear. Stalin, of course, imposes a blockade in 1948 in an effort to try and starve the Western powers out of West Berlin, which ultimately fails. After 11 months, Stalin effectively has to climb down. Mid to late 1950s, Khrushchev too, on various occasions, threatens to go to war over West Berlin. On several occasions, he threatens to sign a peace treaty with East Germany, essentially arguing that this would end the West's occupation rights in Berlin and essentially threatening to forcibly remove Western forces. And of course, the reason he was able to do this is that in many ways, although West Berlin is important for the West, it's also their maximum point of vulnerability. The western part of the city is basically indefensible. There's a few garrisons of American, British, French troops there, but basically the Soviets could conceivably have seized West Berlin anytime that they wanted. The only thing, obviously, holding them back was the threat of a more general war. West Berlin, also a problem for the Soviets in that it is also effectively, as I say, this is point number 4 here, a hole in the Iron Curtain. In the 1950s, if you were an East German citizen, especially if you lived in or fairly close to East Berlin, it was relatively easy to escape to the West. You could simply go on an underground train, subway from East Berlin into the western part of the city, or literally just physically walk from one part of the city to the other, announce that you wanted, basically walk to a West German reception centre, announce that you wanted a new life in the West, and you would be given a passport, what was known as welcome money, and you could simply fly out and start a new life in the Federal Republic of Germany or West Germany. And of course, thousands and thousands of East Germans throughout the 1950s availed themselves of this opportunity. Prominent among them, of course, were very much the younger generation, the sorts of people that East Germany could not afford to lose. So the result of this is that there are a succession of Berlin crises, beginning with, as I mentioned a moment ago, the Berlin blockade from 1948 to 49. Then the 1950s are also punctured by a series of crises when, as I say, Khrushchev threatened to sign a peace treaty with the German Democratic Republic, that is, communist East Germany, essentially arguing that this would end the West's occupation rights in Berlin, and essentially threatening to go to war over Berlin. In 1958, Khrushchev gave the Western powers a 6-month deadline, threatening that he would intervene militarily if there was not a diplomatic settlement by that time. The 6 months came and went, and Khrushchev essentially sort of quietly seemed to forget about it. Then with the new president, John F. Kennedy, Khrushchev again basically attempts to test the new president. Khrushchev and Kennedy meet in Vienna in 1961, and the meeting is a disaster, with it ending with Khrushchev basically threatening a war over Berlin, Kennedy replying that it might be a cold winter, Mr. Chairman. So the Berlin confrontation basically reaches its zenith in 1961. And again, I'm going to cut a very long story short here, but for various reasons, East and West American military diplomats were finding themselves increasingly in confrontation with the Soviets, to the point at which there is a crisis in 1961. Ultimately, though, Kennedy displays enough resolve, makes it clear to Khrushchev that the United States and its allies were not going to withdraw from West Berlin, and eventually Khrushchev backs down and decides that he has no alternative but to construct a wall around the western sector, essentially physically preventing East Germans and people living in East Berlin from being able to move from one part of the city to the other. Now, the wall wasn't a particularly attractive solution, but as Kennedy said at the time, a wall was better than a war. And although, in many ways it was a sort of humanitarian disaster for the people living in Berlin, suddenly families found themselves divided. Paradoxically, though, the wall suddenly provides at least a degree of stability. It basically, as I say, the point number one there, it removes the one major source of instability in Europe thereafter. So from 1961 onwards, you don't really see another major Berlin crisis. The Soviets, more or less, with the physical division of the city, except that the West, or the Western powers, were there to stay, that they were not going to withdraw from West Berlin. The following year, you have another crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when Khrushchev deployed medium-range missiles on Cuba. Kennedy, U-2 flights discover the secret deployment. Kennedy decides to blockade the island. And for a point, it looks like there could be a nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union. But the crisis, after 13 days, is eventually resolved. I think both superpowers come away shaken from that experience. But of course, neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev were in office for much longer. I mean, the following year, just over a year after the crisis, Kennedy was obviously assassinated in Dallas. The year after that, Khrushchev is also deposed, removed from power. So the two men, I mean, there were indications after Cuba that both Kennedy and Khrushchev realized that it might be time to work towards a new kind of relationship. But as I say, neither man was in power after 1964. Moving a little further onwards, you have the Prague Spring in 1968, so a sort of minor, well, maybe not minor, but an uprising in Czechoslovakia. This time it was a communist party, people like Dubčev talking about communism with a human face. And like in Hungary in 1956, it culminates with a Soviet military intervention. Leonid Brezhnev, the new Soviet leader, made it clear that he would not allow a communist government to be toppled, intervenes, albeit much less bloodily than had been the case in Hungary in 1956, which again serves to emphasize, if you like, a sort of lack of legitimacy in Eastern Europe. But it has been argued that paradoxically the Soviet intervention sort of lays the foundations for the subsequent period of detente, in that it gave the Soviets, or Brezhnev at least, felt it gave them more room for maneuver. Having quelled another insurrection, the Soviets felt that there was enough stability in the Eastern Bloc to allow them to embark upon a new kind of foreign policy venture. So what was detente? The word basically means, obviously a French word, loosely translated I think into English, it translates as relaxation. So essentially talking about a relaxation of tensions between the two superpowers. what happens in the late 60s and 70s isn't entirely unique, because there had been other periods of the Cold War in which there had been a thaw or an improvement in the superpower relationship. You see a brief thaw, for example, after Stalin's death, when there are indications that the Soviet government might pursue a more liberal course. That comes to a fairly brutal end with the Hungarian intervention in 1956. Similarly, as I mentioned a moment ago, after Cuba, there was talk of perhaps the two superpowers building a new type of relationship. However, it's not really until the late 1960s that you see Detente again come to the fore as a major foreign policy objective. Why does Detente happen? I think the very simple answer is that both superpowers wanted it to happen. So just as you need two willing parties to negotiate for an improvement in the superpower relationship to actually take place, it required both the United States and the Soviet Union to actually engage with one another in a constructive and in a reasonably, let's say, warm way. So as I say, both the United States and the Soviets wanted Detente to happen. In other words, they basically, this is point number 1 on the slide here, they basically believed that it would be in their own best interests to stabilize the relationship. I think there are several reasons for that. Notably, I'm going to pass over this pretty quickly, but notably, both superpowers have their own major external foreign policy problems with which they are having to contend. In the case of the United States, mid to late 60s, it's obviously Vietnam. So it sort of makes sense from a sort of geostrategic point of view to try and improve relations with the Soviets, given that more and more resources are having to be devoted to the war in Southeast Asia. It's also, I think, fair to say that certainly Nixon and his national security advisor Kissinger, who come into office in 1969, beginning of 1969, think that the Soviets might actually help to extricate the United States from Vietnam. That Soviet good officers might be useful when it came to negotiating this kind of face-saving solution to the war in Vietnam. So for the Americans, the problem is Vietnam. For the Soviets, the problem is communist China. Despite the fact that this was a fellow communist government, relations with China begin to break down in the 1960s. Mao Zedong, who had been very much an admirer of Stalin, was altogether less respectful, I think it's fair to say, of Nikita Khrushchev when he comes to power. And the relationship steadily deteriorates to the point at which both superpowers are publicly hurling insults at one another by the late 1960s. And you have a series of border clashes. Again, if you look at a map, the Soviet Union, or today's Russia, shares a huge border, massive land frontier with communist China, and there's a series of military clashes, some of which are pretty significant in the late 60s, especially in 1969, to the point at which the Soviet Union and China are virtually at war with one another. So for the Soviets, given the problems with which they are having to face with China, it sort of again makes sense for them from a strategic point of view to try and stabilize relations with the United States. The fourth point there, both superpowers were certainly conscious of the dangers of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis had demonstrated that as well. Khrushchev talks about this idea of peaceful coexistence between the two superpowers, and again, the two sides begin to sort of embrace these ideas by the late 1960s. I think another factor, which I haven't actually put on the slide here, but it is worth considering, is the various personalities of the leaders in the late 60s, early 70s. Nixon in particular. I think it's fair to say, a number of biographies on Nixon make this point. I think it's fair to say that Nixon certainly had a deep desire to go down in history as a world statesman. In his inaugural address as president in 1969, he declares very publicly that they were now entering into an era of negotiations. So Nixon, despite his reputation for being a cold warrior and a hardliner, essentially emphasizing the importance of diplomacy towards the Soviet bloc once he becomes president at the beginning of 1969. So what was Detente? I think Detente had several features. One was the arms control negotiations. There was and that encompassed a wide range of military capabilities. But the most famous of which were the ones involving strategic nuclear missiles. We'll come back to that. Second point, high-level diplomacy. Well, not just high-level diplomacy, but diplomacy, I would say, at all levels. But obviously the most public forms of that were the meetings between the two heads of government. I think Khrushchev, Brezhnev and Nixon, they meet each other, I think, about 4 or 5 times in the space of 3 or 4 years. Nixon travels to Moscow in the summer of 1972, shortly after his famous visit to China. The following year, Brezhnev returns the favor, goes to Washington. Nixon again towards the end of his presidency. So it was 3 times, thinking about it. Nixon, right in the final months of his presidency, also travels back to Moscow for his third and final meeting with Brezhnev. So diplomacy, superpower symmetry, that was a major feature. Then there was a lot of symbolism, sport, cultural exchanges, as I say there. So the Soviet National Sympathy Orchestra trying to... going to New York to play and things like that. From the European perspective, and I want to bring the Europeans into this in a moment, but from the European perspective and European attitudes to Detente, for the most part, I think there is a sense of relief in the late 1960s, early 1970s, because Detente basically reduce the likelihood of war between the two superpowers, and given the fact that if a European war had broken out, the Europeans would be in the front line, that from the European perspective was obviously a pretty good thing. On the other hand, and Lunderstad makes this point in his book, there's an underlying apprehension among some Europeans at least of the possibility that there could be some kind of deal between the two superpowers over Europe, that perhaps the United States might in some way sell out Europe, come to a deal which was at the expense of European interests as a result of this. So there was, as I say, a degree of apprehension in the eyes of at least some Europeans when the relations between the Americans and Soviets seemed to improve. One European leader who was obviously intensely suspicious of the United States was Charles de Gaulle, the French president. He was deeply distrustful of the United States, and that manifested itself in various ways, most spectacularly in his decision to withdraw from NATO, in the decision of de Gaulle's France to join from NATO's military structures in the summer of 1966. But you also have the so-called economic war with the United States, in which France exchanges American dollars in return for gold as a way of sort of undermining the American currency, and various other things like that. De Gaulle essentially advocates a more independent European policy, but an independent European policy sort of led by France. Crucially, again, as we mentioned in previous classes, de Gaulle decides that that Great Britain must be excluded from the European project as well, simply because the British are far too close to the United States in his eyes. Another figure who was deeply wary of American intentions was Konrad Adenauer, the West German statesman. He's in office from 1949 until his retirement in 1963. And Adenauer famously says he has a nightmare, and that nightmare is called Potsdam. What he basically meant by that was that Germany's future in 1945 was basically decided by the three Allied powers, Churchill, Stalin, and Truman, meeting in Potsdam, and between them deciding the fate of post-war Europe, but also more particularly the fate of Germany. So Adenauer decides, next time Germany's future is to be decided, the Germans themselves must have by far the biggest say. So Adenauer becomes West German statesman, becomes Chancellor of West Germany from 1949, and as I say, despite the fact that he is a relatively old man, he's in office for a good 14 years, and I think Adenauer's mission was essentially, well, first and foremost, it was to restore German sovereignty. Most importantly, and we'll talk more about Adenauer and his vision for Germany in rather more detail in our discussion class. But most importantly, he viewed West Germany's future as being one in which West Germany was fully integrated into European and Atlantic institutions. So Adenauer's mission was to fully integrate West Germany into these Western institutions. He was less interested, again for various reasons, we will talk about that, but he was less interested in the idea of unification. It's not to say he was uninterested, but he did not view that as a particular priority. Moreover, West Germany essentially reaches a position in which it can more or less dictate what NATO's German policy was actually going to be. And this was partly because Germany was too important to ignore, so other leaders, including the United States, had to be sensitive to the West German government's concerns. It was also the fact that by emphasizing the importance of West Germany's place within Western institutions, Adenauer was effectively signaling that he was not willing to contemplate a united, neutral Germany. He basically says it's important that West Germany remain part of NATO and the European community. So it was always going to be hard for other statesmen, particularly, as I say, a United States president, to override this, to essentially say, look, we don't want Germany in NATO anymore. We would rather have a unified, neutral Germany. That was obviously going to be an almost impossible position to sustain. So, as I say, Adenauer, partly, as I say, because of Germany's importance, but also partly because of the particular policies that he was very clearly pursuing in the 1950s, early 1960s, basically is in a position to more or less dictate NATO's policy towards the German question. It's also Adenauer who basically begins to lay the foundations for West Germany's approach towards the East after the Second World War. And essentially, West Germany adopts what becomes known as the Halsted Doctrine, in which the West Germans pursue a policy of non-recognition towards the communist bloc. Essentially, the Halsted Doctrine states that West Germany would not have diplomatic relations with any other country that had a formal diplomatic relationship with communist East Germany, which in practice basically means that West Germany is ignoring ignoring the rest of the communist bloc. As I say, Germany's policy basically becomes NATO's policy. So in the 1950s, 1960s, the West in general, West Germany's allies, do not have any diplomatic dealings with with countries which were part of the communist bloc. The one exception is the Soviet Union. In 1955, diplomatic relations are established between Moscow and Bonn. And there are several, again, maybe I won't dwell on the exact reasons for that, but one important reason is that Adenauer recognizes that the Soviet Union is too big to ignore. He also recognizes that if Germany is ever to be reunified, it's going to require the consent of the Soviet Union. So essentially, the Soviets are the one exception to the Halsted Doctrine. And some historians trace the roots of Ostpolitik back to this meeting in 1955. However, the Halsted Doctrine basically precludes the possibility of a sort of wider detente by having this policy of non-recognition, which, as I say, basically all of NATO was more or less following. It basically minimized the possibility of establishing sort of intense diplomatic contacts with the Eastern Bloc. The Halsted Doctrine, though, begins to break down in the 1960s. Adenauer leaves office in 1963. He's briefly replaced by Ludwig Erhard. After he loses power, though, in 1966, a coalition government made up of Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, a grand coalition, comes to office. And Willy Brandt, the leader of the Social Democrats, takes the job of foreign minister. And Willy Brandt has basically come to the belief that it is important for West Germany to engage more actively with the Eastern Bloc. So towards the end of the 60s, the Halsted Doctrine begins to break down. Trade missions, for example, are established with a number of East European countries. They're not embassies, so it's not formal diplomatic relations, but nonetheless, contacts are increased. And then, I forget exactly when, but towards the end of the decade, diplomatic relations are established with, I think, Romania and Yugoslavia. So two communist countries, but which were not were not deeply embedded within the Soviet bloc, but a clear indication that West Germany's Eastern policy was beginning to evolve. Then in 1969, there is a West German election and a social democratic government comes to power led by Willy Brandt. So Willy Brandt becomes chancellor in 1969 and basically begins a fairly controversial policy of intensifying West Germany's engagement with the Eastern Bloc, beginning with you see the following year, 1970, the negotiation of the first of a series of treaties with various countries in the Eastern Bloc. The first is with the Soviet Union, again reflecting the importance of Moscow in the eyes of the West Germans, but this is quickly followed up with treaties with countries like Poland and others, and ultimately culminates with a treaty with communist East Germany in 1972. And it should be noted, and again, I think Garton Ash in his book on Ostpolitik makes this point, West German policy can only really happen in the wider framework of detente. So there is, from the beginning, a sort of relationship between what's happening on the wider international scene in the late 1960s and 1970s and the approach that the West Germans themselves are adopting in this period. One reason they can do it is that because West Germany is so entrenched in NATO and the European community, it's now in a position to start engaging more actively. West Germany's allies, let's say, are less fearful, although there are concerns, and we'll come back to that, but West Germany's allies are less fearful with West Germany's more independent approach towards the Eastern Bloc. In terms of West Germany's dealings with the East, probably the biggest problem is that as late as the late 1960s, the West Germans were still claiming possession of, were still formally making the claim that they should formally possess Germany's eastern territories. So the West Germans were basically saying that a united Germany's frontiers should be those of December 1937. That is, before the Anschluss with Austria and the annexation of the Sudetenland and all the other territories that Nazi Germany seized from 1938 onwards. So essentially, the West Germans were saying that a unified German state should still be in possession of territories like East Prussia, which in 1937 was still separated from the rump of Germany by the Polish corridor, and various other territories in the east which had been lost at the end of the Second World War. So probably the single biggest concession that the West Germans make in their negotiations with the Soviets is that they basically formally accept the post-1945 eastern frontier with Poland. So Brandt essentially says if unification were to ever come about, a unified Germany's eastern border would be with the post-1945 frontier with Poland. And this is actually noted, many historians have made this point, but essentially, the eastern frontier with Poland is more or less recognized in the Moscow Treaty, which is signed in August 1970. So not with the Poles, but with the Soviets, the West Germans. The West Germans explicitly acknowledge this. The Moscow Treaty, 1970, is basically a non-aggression pact between the West Germans and the Soviets. So essentially, it's establishing, or improving the bilateral relationship, and, as I say, essentially a non-aggression pact. But, as I said, the West Germans do formally recognise their eastern frontier. Brandt famously says that with this treaty, this is the Moscow Treaty, nothing is lost that has not long since been gambled away. So in other words, Brandt is basically saying, it's not me who is responsible for the loss of Germany's eastern territories. Blame Hitler. Blame Hitler. Don't blame me for this. The final point there, did the West Germans really renounce their claim to the East? Well, the language is slightly ambiguous, because when they talk about West Germany's eastern frontiers, basically Brandt says, well, not Brandt, but the West German government in the treaty with the Soviets said that the post-1945 frontiers were inviolable. Inviolable basically meaning they could only be changed peacefully. So if something is inviolable, you can only change it peacefully. They can't be forcefully redrawn. Essentially, basically saying that we can accept the 1945 frontiers, but we're leaving open the possibility, however remote that might be, of perhaps potentially redrawing that line in the future if a Polish government consented to it. So the language was slightly ambiguous there, but to all intents and purposes, as I say, West Germany is sort of recognizing that that Yalta Europe, if you like, was here to stay. So the Moscow Treaty signed in 1970, as I say, recognises the inviolability of the post-45 frontiers. It also there's also partially, I probably should put the word partially in point number 3, partially recognises the existence of the German Democratic Republic, in the sense that the German Democratic Republic is formally referred to in the text of the treaty. So the first time that that a West German government had actually indicated the existence of the East German state. Then, end of 1970, there was a second treaty signed with Poland, quite similar to the Moscow Treaty. Again, the West Germans reiterate the post-1945 frontiers. In 1971, there's a change in leadership in East Germany. Erich Honecker replaces Walter Ulbricht, and it has been suggested that one of the reasons why this leadership change takes place is that Ulbricht had not been interested in engaging diplomatically with West Germany. Honecker was more amenable, and so the Soviets sort of oversee this transition. They want an East German government that is more amenable to the idea of doing business with the West Germans. 1972, you see the basic treaty signed between the two German states. The West Germans never regard this as an international treaty because they do not recognize communist East Germany as being an independent sovereign state in its own right. But they are sort of willing, as I say, to engage in business with it. So high commissions rather than embassies are established in the two parts of Germany, and this clears the way for both German states to join the United Nations in 1973. Also worth noting, in 1971, a quadripartite agreement over Berlin is signed. So a four-power agreement in Berlin is signed. This is significant because the West Germans stipulate that ratification of the Moscow Treaty can only take place once a treaty, once the Berlin Treaty has been agreed to. The four-power agreement basically recognizes the status quo, that Berlin was going to remain divided, and that the three military powers. There's some ambiguity as to whether the treaty covered the four powers or the three powers. It was left deliberately ambiguous, but it certainly acknowledged that the British, the French, and the Americans were there to stay in West Berlin. In terms of other states' reactions to all of this, I think it's fair to say that there was a distinct lack of enthusiasm for West Germany's new activist foreign policy towards the Eastern Bloc, and I have a quotation here from an American National Security Council memorandum, which I came across, saying here, we should not conceal our longer-range concern of the potentially divisive effect in the Western Alliance and inside Germany of any excessively active German policy in Eastern Europe, as well as our concern over the potential risks of a crisis that such a policy might create in relations between Eastern European states and USSR. So the Americans, as this memorandum suggests, were not entirely happy with West Germany's Ostpolitik. And if you look at, I've actually looked at some of the documents, some of the published documents in foreign relations in the United States, which show that Nixon and Kissinger were distinctly unhappy with Ostpolitik. On the other hand, they can't do anything to prevent it, or at least they feel that they can't do anything to prevent it. They feel that publicly opposing Brandt would be counterproductive, not least because Ostpolitik is actually quite popular inside the United States, insofar as Americans have much of an awareness about it. Brandt, too, was quite popular. He sort of had a sort of Kennedy-esque persona in West German politics. He started his political career as a relatively young man. I think he had quite an attractive Norwegian wife and there were comparisons with Jackie Kennedy. So Brandt himself, was relatively popular in Europe and the United States. So despite their reservations, the Americans decide that they can't really actively work to block or undermine Ostpolitik. Interestingly, I think Brandt meets Nixon at Camp David in 1973, and he thanks Nixon for the support that the United States has given for Ostpolitik, and Nixon replies saying, I didn't support it, I just didn't oppose it. Again, make it clear he wasn't, as I say, all that enthusiastic about it. Other European countries were also not entirely happy. The French also expressed reservations. The British, again, I've seen some of the British documents on this. Edward Heath, the British Prime Minister, was distinctly unenthusiastic in the early 1970s. On the other hand, the British felt that they couldn't publicly oppose Ostpolitik because they were relying on German support for membership of the European community. So again, the British sort of swallow their doubts and don't come out in overt opposition to what the West Germans are doing. In general, though, as I say, there is sort of concern among the Europeans about this sort of more independent posture that the West Germans are taking towards the East. More generally, point number one there, so America's position in relation to Europe begins to slip. I think that's important in some ways, and especially in relation to Vietnam, which we will come to in a moment. Europe begins to strike a more independent posture, where we noted de Gaulle in the 1960s, and then to some extent Ostpolitik with the West Germans in the 1970s. Overall, I mean, beginning of the 1970s, this is a period of kind of political turbulence and economic turbulence. And so, yeah, I think this does have sort of consequences for relations with the United States. European politics becomes a bit more radicalized. So obviously the 60s is the era of the hippies and flower power and all the rest of it, student protests, major student protests in France in 1968 that become very close to driving de Gaulle from power. The nuclear issue as well, and maybe we'll come back to this in a bit more detail in another class, but the issue of nuclear weapons on European territory, that begins to become more controversial, particularly among leftist groups and political parties. And then you've got Vietnam in the background. Again, I don't want to exaggerate the importance of Vietnam for Europeans, but I think, again, it's fair to say that in general, popular opinion in Europe becomes markedly more anti-American as a consequence of the war in Vietnam. It's notable, for example, that no European government, including the British, are willing to send military forces to Southeast Asia to fight. Even when the Americans asked the British for a sort of token commitment, to send a handful of troops to Vietnam in order to kind of demonstrate some kind of support, the British simply aren't interested. So the British opt for a policy of neutrality. It's partly because Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister, hopes that he can act as a sort of intermediary. Johnson later accuses Wilson of having a sort of, I've forgotten his exact words, but a sort of Nobel Peace Prize fever. Is also the fact that the British, to some extent, are sort of hoping that the Australians and the New Zealanders, by sort of sending forces to Vietnam, can act as a British substitute. Sometimes this is called the Hessian option, reference to sort of Hessian mercenaries who were paid by the British in European wars, I think in the 17th or 18th centuries. I've certainly seen, this is point number two, I've certainly seen text of telephone conversations between Harold Wilson and Johnson, which were pretty testy, to the point at which Johnson is more or less sort of abusing Wilson and making it clear just how unhappy he is with the British stance on the war. Other European governments even more critical. Nixon meets, I might have mentioned this before, but Nixon meets de Gaulle in 1969. And Nixon is an admirer of de Gaulle. But, in the conversation, which is generally, pretty good-natured, the two men getting on well, de Gaulle sort of reveling in the role of elder statesman, tutoring the new American president. When they do get onto Vietnam, de Gaulle very bluntly tells Nixon, you can't win in Vietnam. You're going to have to withdraw on Vietnam, which is not advice that Nixon, at this stage at any rate, it's not advice that he wants to receive. Then there's the issue of burden sharing, which I haven't really mentioned, but it's really important in the 1960s. And remains important, right the way throughout the Cold War and indeed up until the present day. But there's a general perception by the late 60s and early 70s that the Europeans aren't sharing enough of the burden. The Wenger article on how NATO is reformed touches upon the issue of the so-called offset agreements negotiated by the Johnson administration with the West German government, essentially asking the West Germans to make a bigger contribution to America's force deployments in Germany. But the issue of burden sharing becomes even more acute in the 1970s as the American economy, in common with most of the industrialized world, starts running into difficulties. You have the oil shocks in the early 70s and things like that. So 1970s, not a good decade economically, and the issue of how much the United States is spending becomes increasingly sort of politicized. Should also be said, by the early 70s, isolationist sentiment is beginning to stir once again in the United States. Senator Mike Mansfield, I think he was a Democrat senator, tabled several resolutions in the Senate calling for a complete withdrawal of American forces from Europe, which garners a substantial amount of support. But they don't pass, but it is indicative that there is sort of growing disenchantment with America's military presence in Europe. How big was the division between the United States and Europe? Well, again, I'll be careful not to exaggerate. I think most Europeans in the late 60s, 70s still realize that the United States is their chief guarantor, that they are still very much reliant on the United States for providing security. It's notable, for example, that for all their sort of frustrations with NATO, no other country follows France's lead and withdraws from NATO's military structures. So for all the problems, as I say, the Atlantic Alliance doesn't come close to collapsing, and you certainly don't. The United States certainly doesn't experience the sorts of problems that the Soviet Union is beginning to experience, roughly the same time in Eastern Europe. Yes, de Gaulle is a problem, but when it comes to it, France remains an ally of the United States and would almost certainly be, contributing its own military forces if Europe's security was ever severely threatened by the Soviet Union. Detente in Europe. You have the strategic arms limitations talks in Geneva, which are important in terms of arms control, without wishing to get too much into technicalities, but they essentially established ceilings on the number of missiles both superpowers can possess. There is a second SALT treaty in 1979, although that is not ever actually ratified by the US Congress. 1974 Power Conference on Berlin, we've mentioned, which culminates in the Quadripartite Treaty. And mid-1970s, and we'll talk much more about that in the next lecture, you have the Conference on Security Cooperation in Europe, which is convened in 1973 and culminates in the signing of the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, which is really important, but I am not going to discuss it now. I will talk a little bit about it in the beginning of the next lecture. But in many ways, Helsinki is the sort of high watermark of Detente in 1975. It involves basically virtually all European states. I think the only European government which was not included was Albania. They sat that one out, plus the United States and Canada. And yeah, it's basically based, the Helsinki Final Act is basically based on very much Detente principles. But I will go into that in a bit more detail. And there is also a very good article on the reading list which discusses the significance of Helsinki, written by, I think her name is Angela Romano, and I would recommend having a read of that if you're interested. Okay, I will finish there for today.